Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. In the last video I had the opportunity to try the new telephoto lens by Fujifilm, the XF 70-300. I really enjoy this lens and I think it's a wonderful piece of glass. In today's video what I want to show you is how to edit a couple of images I took during these couple of days. If you haven't seen the previous video, I put the link up here, and that's it. Let's dive into Capture One. Here we are in Capture One and I'm gonna show you how I edited this image taken with the X-T30 and the 70-300 during my trip here in Tuscany. This is the final edit, and here we have got all the adjustments layers I applied, but let me show you the original raw image straight out of the camera. This is the before and this is the after. This is the before and this is the after. Totally different, right? The image is flat with extremely low contrast and dull colors, so we surely need to address a lot of stuff. Instead of going with a step-by-step edit from scratch, which would take too much time for this shot and the video would end up being too long, I much prefer to don't waste your time and guide you through each layer, showing the adjustments I made and the principles behind the process. As you can see, we have got a low contrast image, and that's because of the haze in the scene. And since I used a super long focal length, we had to go through a lot of atmosphere. I used the circular polarizer to cut a bit more through the haze, but we can't do everything just using filters, and that's why we need to adopt the right strategy with post-processing to tackle the haze in order to get back the proper amount of contrast and colors. Throughout the video, I'll give you some useful keyboard shortcuts to speed up your workflow, so keep note because some of them save you a lot of time. If you have never checked out Capture One, I would highly recommend you do it, just to take a look at it and just to see how it's different from Lightroom. In the video description I put the link to download a free 30-day trial if you want to give it a go, and if you are on the fence to buy it, you can use the discount code Livieri10 at checkout to get a 10% off of your Capture One copy. Before starting with the edits, let me show you very quickly what's the plan with this image. The first step is cropping the image in order to have this small tree placed in the center of our frame. Then we want to increase the global and local contrast in these rolling hills with the dodge and burn, also emphasizing the shadows created by the hay bales. The top part of the frame with the land in the distance is quite messy, so introducing some haze can be a good option to hide some of the details and making them less distracting. The last step is to equalize the color balance globally and in different areas using the color grading tool. Our goal is to achieve a relatively dark contrasty mood. Okay, first thing first, I recropped the image keeping the original aspect ratio, and that's because I want to keep right in the center this tiny tree in the distance, which is going to be our main focal point. To do so, you can choose the crop tool here on the top tools menu, or using our first keyboard shortcut, the keyboard C button, which selects the crop tool. H is to get back to the hand tool. So C, crop tool, H, hand tool. So let's select the C tool and let's recrop our image. Another handy tool is the overlay grid that can be activated using Command G or Ctrl G on Windows, and that allows you to be very precise on the cropping. Press enter and done. My next adjustment is the noise reduction, which I set, let's see, at 20. The default setting of 50 is usually too high for my taste. I took this image with the camera on the tripod at the lowest ISO. It's very clean, and here on the bottom left you can see the image has been taken at ISO 160, so there is no point to raise the luminance value too high, so 20 is fine. Now for the next step, we want to apply some basic tone adjustments to set the foundation. If you are familiar with my previous videos, you already know that I like to start my edits applying a curve profile. In this pop-up menu, you can find many different profiles, and you might find this list different from yours. And that's because you are probably using a different camera brand or model. Anyway, for this image, I found the film standard profile, which is a native profile in Capture One, works the best. So let's change the core profile from auto to the native film standard, and here we go. Let's check with auto. Absolutely flat. I don't like it. With film standard, I quite like the effect it creates in the image. Compared with the auto core profile, it's punchier, the image is more saturated, and it increased the overall contrast. In this next variant, you can see I increased the white balance temperature to warming up the blue tones and place the overall tones towards a more sunny feeling. Let's see the before, and this is the after. It's always important to find a sweet spot to keep from killing the colors balance, making the image too warm like this or maybe too cold. Okay? This is another variance where I applied some contrast adjustments, and to increase the global contrast and set a great foundation on where to build all the other adjustments, instead of using the exposure panel sliders, I used the levels panel. Nothing too different from the regular workflow, but sometimes for specific situation I quite like to have a bit more freedom to set the blacks and the whites and midtones. Just clicking, let me reset for a moment this adjustment. And just clicking on this magic wand icon, we are going to stretch the histogram, optimizing the brightness distribution of the image. In this case, I don't want to set the black and the white point so high, because I want to keep enough room to adjust the shadows and highlights later on using dedicated luminosity masks. So we're going to drag this small pointer for the shadows back. And also we are going to reset the white point to 255 RGB value, and I'm gonna decrease the mid point right there. The middle slider tells Capture One where the 50% point is, so the midtones. Dragging it, you can make everything in the middle brighter or darker. In this case, we want to reduce the midtone since we want to create a relatively dark image. We also want to decrease the highlights to have as many details as we can in the brightest areas to give us more option on the following steps. Then I added a bit of contrast and opened the shadow a little bit and increased the exposure and saturation just a tad. Let's see the before and after of these adjustments. Here we go, before and after, and this panel here. We can increase the contrast even more, creating a nest curve here in the curve panel. It's a very basic curve with the black point lifted at 6 to get slightly faded blacks, and also the white point is slightly decreased in order to get a sort of creamy whites when we will add the haze in the top part of the frame. And adding some clarity works perfectly in this case, not too much. It's very tempting to go overboard with this adjustment, so always be careful. 10, 15 as value is perfect. Remember, we want to build the contrast by going through multiple small steps to have more control over the final result and not just in a single move. Alright, once we have the image cropped and we set the foundations, we can start building our adjustment layers, and the first thing we want to do is removing a bunch of distractions. I mean, these 3 hay bales that are too close to the edges for my liking, so I created a heel layer named Retouch, and then I removed the object. Very easy task. But let me show you quickly how to create from scratch a heel layer. You want to click and hold the plus button on the layers panel and select new heel layer. Then you need to select the healing tool. Here we go. And then you can start removing the unwanted stuff by painting over the distracting objects. Capture One takes a new origin based on the content you are painting on. Great, you get it super simple. Okay, next step, we want to start introducing local contrast using the luminosity masks, and here is where lies the core of our edit. Capture One has an extremely powerful set of functions and slider adjustments related to the luminosity mask tool. and it's way more versatile than the more basic range masks you can find in Adobe Lightroom. If you're not familiar with luminosity masks, they are tone-based selections that make it possible to make targeted adjustments to only specific areas of the image. These masks can select the brights, midtones, or darks without affecting other parts of the photo. It's an extremely powerful technique, mostly used in Photoshop, but Capture One has a wonderful tool, the Luma range, that allows you to create targeted luminosity masks like in Photoshop, but with a huge benefit of working directly on the raw data. Let's start working on the land area. I created a new field layer. I renamed it Land. Pay attention, when you click on the plus button here on the Layers panel, by default Capture One creates an empty layer, but we need a field layer. And to create it, you want to left click and hold and select the new field adjustment layer. Clicking the M keyboard key, we can display the mask, and as you can see, the image is completely green. That means we are applying the adjustments to the entire image, but it's not what we want to do. So let's cancel this layer, and we are going to move to the land layer I already created. From here, we are going to activate the layer, and you can see what it's doing to the image. It adds contrast by decreasing the brightness in the shadows. Let's select for a moment the Luma range to see what I've done. And here in this pop-up window, we can set where to apply the adjustment based on the brightness level, dragging left and right the 2 pointers at the top. As you can see, I already set up the different sliders restricting the adjustments to the shadows. We can also define the fall off both for blacks and whites with these two lower pointers. They are very useful to tweak the transition of the mask, softer or edgier. There are other two sliders in the Luma range tool, radius and sensitivity. The sensitivity slider determines how hard or soft the edges of the mask will be. High sensitivity gives sharper edges and low sensitivity has softer edges. The radius slider instead controls the strength of the sensitivity sliders. To get a best view of the mask we are creating and see precisely what all the handles and the sliders are doing, try using the grayscale mask instead of the default red overlay. You can activate or deactivate the grayscale mask using the keyboard shortcut Alt-Option-M. If you notice, my mask is green. I changed the default setting by going to Preferences, Appearance, and select the mask color you prefer. Or you can use the shortcut key, Command and comma, and choose here the color you prefer. Okay, once we defined the range, we're going to click Apply, and then we are going to tweak the exposure value there. Okay, just this little adjustment makes a huge difference on our image. Let's see the before and after. Before and after. Before and after. That's a massive difference. If you want to zoom out, like I'm doing here, okay, you can use the proof margin. There is a specific function here in Capture One. You can actually zoom out more than the 100%. So to adjust the size of the window, you need to set the proof margin value into the preference module. To access the preference panel, the shortcut key is Command, comma, and the value here, you have to adjust this value, proof margin, and of course it really depends on the resolution of your monitor and your liking. So I set up at 260 for my monitor, and to zoom out you can use the shortcut key X. Zoom in, zoom out, zoom in, zoom out. Now we want to reduce the brightness of this shadow area, which is too bright in my opinion and creates a sort of unbalancing between the left and the right of the frame. So let's activate the layer to see what I've done. I created a new empty adjustment layer, and then I painted with the brush tool the specific area. Let me show you the Luma range adjustments I already prepared. Let's activate the display mask so you can see how it's working. But let's reset the Luma mask for a second to see how the selection looks without it. Let's reset the radius and let's apply. As you can see here, the selection is pretty rough, especially here on the edges. But applying the Luma range mask and cranking the radius value all the way to the right, the transition will be much softer and precise. Let me show you what would happen with the radius to 0. The mask would be super edgy and we end up with unpleasing artifacts on the transition area. It doesn't work with these settings. And to reduce the brightness of this area, I used the levels, decreasing the midtones and the blacks just a tad. Let's see the before and after. This is the before and after, the before and after. Much better. Now let's see how I emphasize the highlights creating another Luma range mask. I created this new layer named highlights and let's see the before and after. The difference is quite impressive. Let's have a look at the Luma range adjustments. These are the settings I used to target right the brightest level. To increase the brightness of this area, I used the levels panel to adjust the brightness, and I also increase the contrast and the brightness, which works on the upper midtones. Let's have a look at the before and after, the before and after. Slightly changes, and this one, the before and after, the before and after. And one more tiny adjustment I made in this layer is on the color balance panel, where I increased the saturation and brightness of yellows and the hue slightly towards the orange to increase the sense of warmth. Our next step is to darken this hill we have in the foreground. It's very important for the global composition. It creates depth, but it grabs too much attention. It looks also a little bit washed out, okay, and we don't need to see so many details. So I created a new adjustment layer. I applied, let's turn on the mask. I applied a linear gradient starting from the bottom and dragging it diagonally towards the top right, like so. And then I decrease the exposure. Let's check the before and after. Great. I went with the same approach to reduce the brightness of this hill on the bottom right that is very bright. So I created a new adjustment layer. I painted with the brush tool in the area I want to darken, and then I defined the brightness range, cutting off the shadows with the Luma range mask, and I made some tweaks, decreasing first of all the exposure and saturation. Let me show you how it works before and after. Then I adjusted the white balance more towards cooler tones, just to neutralize a bit warm tones we have here that doesn't match, in my opinion, with the rest of the image. So let me show you the before and after. And also I decreased the highlights and whites before and after. Okay, let's see the before and after with all the adjustments applied. Before and after. Yeah, much better and less distracting. As we defined in our plan, we need to simulate some fog, some haze in the distance, which helps to improve the depth and to reduce the distractions in the background, making our tiny little tree much more prominent. Let me activate the dedicated adjustment layer. In Capture One, yeah, much difference. In Capture One, to simulate the haze effect, we need to do some steps. In Lightroom, to introduce haze in our images, the process is easier, but in Capture One, the dehaze slider works differently. So to recreate a convincing haze effect, this is the process you want to follow. Let me start from scratch. We're going to create a new empty layer. Let me zoom out to have a better idea what I'm doing. And with the shortcut key L from the keyboard, I'm going to select the linear gradient tool, and I'm going to drag our linear gradients starting from the top towards the bottom. Here we go. Now, what we want to do is to increase the exposure, like so, contrast, the brightness, maybe a little bit of white. I also added a small amount of contrast by dragging the black pointer on the levels panel, and I can also decrease the white balance just a tad to keep the whites more neutral rather than too warm. Very tiny adjustment. If the effect is not enough, you can use the curves rising up the black point till the top. As you can see, emphasize even more the haze effect, but for this image I think is too much, so I think we can stick with this small value. Then with the Luma range mask you can cut off all these adjustments from the darkest areas, softening the transition, dragging back the fall off pointer to keep some contrast. Okay, apply, and as always let's see the before and after, before and after. Let's remove this one and let's reactivate the pre-made. Yeah, that's exactly the same. The next layer is a very simple adjustment to brighten up the top of the frame. Let me activate a linear gradient mask where I increase the exposure, the contrast and the brightness. It's a small adjustment. Let me show you the before and after. It's a small adjustment, but it makes a big difference. And here we are at the last three layers where we are going to tweak the colors. This layer called Blue Shadows helps to inject a bit of coldness into the shadows. The selection is, let me activate, the selection is pretty similar to the one we used on the previous Darkland layer. So I used the Luma range mask to target the shadows. Here we go. And the color balance panel, I added a bit of blue tone with the shadow wheel, keeping the saturation low and decreasing just a tiny bit the luminance. And now we have a bit more color separation. Before and after. Let me zoom out. Before and after. The second to last layer is called color grading, and here I applied global adjustments in terms of colors. What I've done is to introduce a little bit of yellow and green in the midtones, and then I warmed up the highlights, adding a bit of orange, keeping always a lower saturation. Let me show you the before and after. Guys, finally we arrived to the last adjustment layer where I applied subtle color adjustments using the levels panel. Let's activate it. On the levels panel, on the red channel, I reduced the red in the shadows and midtones. On the green channel, the same thing. I reduced the green on the shadows and the midtones, dragging towards the right the two pointers. And in the blue channel, I increased the yellow just in the midtones to warming up the overall image by dragging towards the right this mid pointer. 0.3 is my go-to value. Okay, done. Let's take a look at where we started. This is the before and this is the after. The before and after. Let's check with the split view. Before and after. Before and after. Nice. That's a massive improvement. We started with a super flat, dull and lifeless image, and we ended up with a punchy and contrasty image with beautiful dynamic lights and, in my opinion, much more character. Alright guys, I hope you found this tutorial useful, and if you have any comments or questions, please leave them in the comment section down below. Next year I will lead a workshop here in Tuscany, in this wonderful place of Valdorcia, and if you want to join me, please check out my website. You will find all the details about that. As always, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Ciao!